Volume 4, Chapter 9, Part 1 of the Old Manor House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie Ellen Arden. The Old Manor House by Charlotte Turner Smith. Volume 4, Chapter 9, Part 1. Early the following morning, Orlando left Winchester, but it was between 3 and 4 o'clock before he arrived at that part of the New Forest which is near Christchurch, and the frost, now set in with great severity, had made the roads very difficult for an horse, especially the way which he was directed to pursue, through the forest to the residence of Mrs. Fleming. It was a deep, hollow road, only wide enough for wagons, and was in some places shaded by hazel and other brushwood, in others by old beech and oaks, whose roots wreathed about the bank, intermingled with ivy, holly, and evergreen fern, almost the only plants that appeared in a state of vegetation, unless the pale and sallow mistletoe, which here and there partially tinted with faint green the old trees above them. Orlando, as slowly he picked his way over the rugged road, whose poached surface, now hardened by the frost, hardly allowed a footing to his horse, recollected the hunting parties in the snow which had amused him in America. But the scene on each side of him was very different. The scanty appearance of foliage was quite unlike an American forest, where, in only a few hours after the severest weather, which had buried the whole country in snow, burst into bloom, and presented, beneath the tulip tree and the magnolia, a more brilliant variety of flowers than art can collect in the most cultivated European garden. Orlando, however, loved England, and had early imbibed that fortunate prejudice that it is in England only an Englishman can be happy. Yet he now thought that were he once sure Monimia was lost to him, and his fears of finding it so became every hour more alarming, he should be more wretched in his own country than in any other, since every object would remind him of their cruel separation. In this disposition, trying to accustom himself to reflect on a circumstance which now distracted him, he made a sort of determination, that if all his endeavours to find Monimia were baffled, as they had hitherto been, he would remain only to see the termination of the suit relative to the Rayland estate, in hopes of leaving his mother, brother, and sisters in a more fortunate situation, and reserving for himself only as much as would support him in the itinerant life he should embrace, to wander alone over Europe and America. While he pursued these contemplations, the way became almost impassable, for a small current of water filtering through the rocky bank had spread itself over the road, and formed a sheet of ice, on which his horse was every moment in danger of falling, though the precaution had been taken to turn the shoes. He had before dismounted, and now contrived to get his horse up the last steep part of the hollow, and then, still leading it by the bridle, he followed the footpath which led along its edge. The tufts of trees and thick underwood now became more frequent, and though it was a fine clear evening, the winter sun, almost sunk beneath the horizon, lent only pale and cold rays among the intervening wood. Orlando, supposing that if he were benighted he should no longer distinguish the path, quickened his pace, and the path he followed, diverging a little from the horse road, brought him to a place where the inequalities of the ground, half shaded with brushwood, showed that beneath it were concealed more considerable fragments of ruins than what had appeared above among the trees, from whence the masses of stone were so mantled with ivy they could hardly be distinguished. The path which Orlando continued to pursue wound among them, and led under broken arches and buttresses, which had resisted the attacks of time and violence, towards an old gateway, whose form was yet entire. Everything was perfectly still around. Even the robin, solitary songster of the frozen woods, had ceased his faint vespers to the setting sun, and hardly a breath of air agitated the leafless branches. This dead silence was interrupted by no sound but the slow progress of his horse, as the hollow ground beneath his feet sounded as if he trod on vaults. There was in the scene, and in this dull pause of nature, a solemnity not unpleasing to Orlando, in his present disposition of mind. Certain that the path he was pursuing must lead to some village or farmhouse, and a little apprehensive of the inconvenience that could in this country befall a man accustomed to traverse the deserts of America, he stopped a moment or two, indulging in a mournful reverie, before he began to remove, in order to make a passage for his horse, a kind of bar, or rather broken gate, which, with thorns and a faggot or two piled under it, passed from one side to the other of the broken arch, and made here, with an hedge, that was carried among the ruins, a division of the forest, or perhaps one of its boundaries. As he meditated here, he heard, not far from him, human voices, which seemed to be those of children, and, leaning over the bar, to see if he could discern the persons who spoke, he observed a female figure seated on a mass of fallen stone, and apparently waiting for two girls, one about 9, the other 7 years old, who were prattling together, as they peeped about in search of something among the fern stacks and low tufts of broom that were near. The woman, whose face was turned towards them, seemed lost in thought. Her straw bonnet was tied down close to her face, and she was wrapped in a long black cloak. A little basket stood by her, and her appearance, as well as that of the children, was such as seemed to denote that though they were not of the peasantry of the country, they were as little to be ranked among its most affluent inhabitants. Orlando, apprehending that the approach of a stranger in such a place and at such a time might alarm so defenceless a party, proceeded with as little noise as possible to unfasten the bar; but, on his approach, the young woman arose, and in apparent hurry said, 'Come, my loves, you forget how late it is, and that your mamma will expect us.' The voice riveted Orlando to the spot for a moment. He then involuntarily stepped forward, and saw Monimia. He repeated her name wildly, as if he doubted whether he possessed his senses, and as he clasped her to his bosom, he found it was indeed his own Monimia. She was unable, from excess of pleasure and surprise, to answer the incoherent questions he asked her. Half frantic with joy as he was, he soon perceived that the suddenness of this meeting had almost overwhelmed her. Silent, breathless, and trembling, she leaned on his arm, without having the power to tell him what he at length understood from the two little girls, who had been at first frighted and then amazed at the scene, that Monimia, or as they called her, Miss Rayland, was now, and had been for some time, under the protection of that very Mrs Fleming, the widow of his gallant friend, whom he was now going to visit. Neither of them knew how they arrived at her humble retirement, a cottage among the woods, fitted up and enlarged, with 2 additional rooms, by a sea officer, the distant relation of Fleming, who was now in America, and who had lent this pleasant, solitary house as a shelter to his widow and her children. Nor was it for some time possible for Orlando properly to explain to Mrs Fleming who he was, or how different those motives were which induced him now to see her, from any hope of finding, in the pious office of visiting the family of his deceased friend, the sole happiness of his life. When at length, amid this disjointed and broken conversation, Mrs Fleming was brought not only to recollect the young man, who, on her husband's embarkation for America, had taken so much pains to be useful to him in the trying moment of separation from his family, but to acknowledge him who had actually received his last breath, and now brought her his dying blessing. Her own afflictions, to a lively sense of which Orlando's account of Fleming's death had awakened her, prevented her, for some time, from attending to the unexpected happiness of her young friends. unable to hear with composure the account which Orlando held himself bound to give, yet solicitously asking questions, the answers to which made her heart bleed afresh, Mrs Fleming at length requested leave to retire, and taking her children with her, Monimia was left at liberty to give the impatient Orlando the account he so eagerly desired to hear, of what had happened to her since the date of the only letter he had ever received from her, which was written not more than 6 weeks after his departure. She doubted of her own strength to give, and of his patience to hear this recital; but he appeared so very solicitous, that she determined to attempt it; and while his eyes were ardently fixed on her face, and watched every turn of her expressive features, which, though she was pale and thin, Orlando thought more lovely than ever, she thus, in a soft and low voice, began: 'As well as I can recollect, Orlando, I related to you in my long letter the troublesome and impertinent intrusion of Sir John Belgrave; and Selina has told you since, that, as he carried his persecution so far as to come into the house, and to endeavour to force his way into my room, I was under the necessity of telling my aunt how he found admittance, and of betraying a secret I had so many reasons to wish might never have been discovered. Alas, Orlando, how much did I not suffer from the bitterness of her reproaches! Sufferings which were sharpened by my being compelled to acknowledge that I had in some measure deserved them, by having carried on a correspondence contrary to what I knew was my duty. Indeed, the punishment I now underwent from day to day seemed sometimes much heavier than the crime deserved, especially when my aunt, to whom my moving was inconvenient, though certainly in that great house there was room enough for me without interfering with her, began to make the discovery I had thus been compelled to make an everlasting theme of reproach to me, to say that such a cunning, intriguing creature was not fit to be in any house, and to threaten me continually to ruin you, Orlando, with Mrs Rayland, by blowing us up, as she was pleased to term it. All this I bore, however hard it was to bear, with silence, and I hope with patience, flattering myself, my dear friend, that the anger we had perhaps mutually deserved would thus be exhausted on me, and that I alone should be the victim, if a victim were required. Yet, when my cruel aunt, unmoved by my resignation and submission, seemed so desirous of getting rid of me, that I believe she would have been glad to have sold me to Sir John Belgrave; and when she insisted upon my consenting to marry him, though I do not believe he ever intended it, and only made that a pretence for getting me into his power, I own there were moments when, in absolute despair, I thought it would hardly have been criminal to have put an end to a life so very insupportable. Nor could I think, have lived, if some of those books you taught me to read and to understand had not instructed me that it was impious to murmur or resist the dispensation of Providence, who knew best what we were able to bear. Perhaps too the dear hope of living in your affection, and of being beloved by you, however hard my lot, lent me a portion of fortitude, for which surely nobody ever had more occasion. For in proportion, Orlando, as Mrs Lennard became attached to that odious Roker, the little affection she had ever shewn me declined, and was changed into dislike and hatred. She was sometimes so much off her guard as to suffer her excessive and ridiculous attachment to him to diminish her attention to her mistress, and on these occasions I used to supply her place. Yet then, if Mrs Rayland seemed pleased with my attendance, she would quarrel with me for attending, and say that she supposed the next thing such an artful slut would think of, would be to supplant her with her lady, and then again she would threaten to blow you up. Indeed, I believe that no situation could be less enviable than that of my poor aunt was at this time, for though certainly, at her age, one would have thought she might have been exempt from suffering much pain from love, She did really appear so tormented by her excessive passion for Roker, and her fears of losing him, that she was an object of pity. If I was below with her lady, while she was with him, then she was afraid of my getting into favour with Mrs Rayland; and if I was above, and he was in the house, she was in terror lest so intriguing a creature should carry off her lover. When I so firmly resisted all the insidious offers of Sir John Belgrave, she doubted whether this delectable Mr Roker was not the cause of it; and even when he happened to come into the room where I was, though she was present, she turned pale with jealousy, and, I suppose, tormented the man, who, though one of the most horrid-tempered monsters existing, commanded himself so much, that he bore it all with an apparent increase of affection, and pretending, in his turn, to be jealous, said that he could not bear to divide her affections even with me. I saw that they were determined to get rid of me, but could not immediately settle how; for though Roker, from time to time, started some plan for that purpose, the lady, always suspecting that he liked me, was fearful lest he should only divide me from her to secure me for himself. 'Execrable villain!' cried Orlando, starting up, 'he dared not think of it.' 'Be patient, Orlando, or I shall never have courage to go on. I know not what was in his imagination, though certainly he took every opportunity of making very improper speeches to me; but detestable as I believe his morals are, his avarice is greater than any other of his odious passions, and this he found he might gratify, when the success of any other was uncertain, and therefore he affected to be as anxious as my aunt was to remove me from Rayland Hall. Ah, my dear friend, what an autumn was that I passed there! Yet my fate, dreary as it appeared to me, was not then at the worst. I had still some sweeteners of my melancholy existence, for I sometimes met Selina, and wept with her, and sometimes, when I was convinced Sir John Belgrave no longer lingered about the park, where for many weeks I could never go without being insulted by him, I used to get out alone, and stealing away to some of those places we used to visit together, I would lean my head against a tree, or hide my face with my hands, and listening, with closed eyes, to the sounds that were then familiar to us, used to fancy I heard your footsteps among the leaves, or your voice whispering in the air that sighed among the trees. Once, at the old seat on Hurst Hill, I saw your name so lately cut as the very day before you went away. I could have wept on the letters. I believe the tears I afterwards shed there would have worn them out. I took a fancy to the place, which nobody else ever thought of frequenting, and often, as summer came on and the days grew short, I stayed till I was frightened at being out so late, and have run home terrified at every noise. If a pheasant flew up, or a hare darted across the path, they threw me into such terrors that I could hardly reach the house. On these occasions all was well if my aunt's Adonis was with her, but if it happened that he was out when I was, she took it into her head that we were together, or that we might meet, and then she was, I really believe, out of her senses. Very unluckily for me, I came in one evening later than usual, breathless with my foolish fears, and found my poor aunt in terrible agitation, because Mr Roker had promised her to be in at tea time, and he was not yet arrived. She questioned me sharply where I had been, and I said in the mill wood, which was the truth, for I had that evening met Selina. She asked me, with still more asperity, if I had not met somebody? The consciousness that I had made me blush, I believe, very deeply, and I faltered as I said no. In a moment Roker came in, half drunk, and the poor old lady flew at him like a turkey cock, and asked him which way he came. As he was less upon his good behaviour than usual, he came. Well, I came by the mill. Which way should I come from the place where I have been? This confirmed, she thrust me out of the room, and ordering me to go upstairs to bed that moment, she threw herself into a fit, as Rebecca told me afterwards. I do not know how Mr. Roker contrived to appease her. She was reconciled to him the next day, but I was the victim, and was, after that time, forbidden to go out without her leave. This, hard as it was, I could still have borne, because it was just at the time Mrs. Rayland seemed to grow particularly kind to me, and to even have a degree of pleasure in talking to me of you. It was now time to expect to hear from you, and I observed her anxiety every day increase. She often sighed when she spoke of you, and once said that her house seemed to have lost all its cheerfulness since you had left it. And often she would look at an old enamelled picture of Sir Orlando, her grandfather, and comparing his features with yours, admire the likeness, then again regret your absence and sink into low spirits. Indeed, her health seemed every day to decline, and I sometimes thought she was discontented with Mrs. Lennard, though from long habit she was more entirely governed by her than ever. Patterson's having dealt so largely in smuggled goods, and having even made her house a receptacle for them, was discovered by his not being able or willing to bribe a new officer who succeeded some of his old friends, and who, upon that Jonas Wilkinson's turning informer, came one night to the Hall, and made seizure of about £200 worth of spirits, tea, and lace, a thing that offended Mrs. Rayland extremely, as she thought it derogatory to her dignity, and a profanation of her cellars, which, as we know, and Monimia faintly smiled, are immediately adjoining to the family vault of the Raylands. This, and other things, particularly some of his amours, which now came to her knowledge, had occasioned her to dismiss Pattenson, and to think higher of you for the pains Pattenson had taken to prejudice her against you. But the dismission, and soon afterwards the death of Pattenson, and the disgrace of the old coachman, who was a party concerned in this contraband business, and who had besides displeased Mrs. Rayland by setting up a whisky and dressing his daughters in the most expensive fashion, threw the old lady more than ever into the power of my aunt, though how she escaped being included in the charge, I never could imagine. I know she was acquainted with, and I believe she was concerned in the clandestine trade, which had for so many years been carried on at Rayland Hall, but probably Pattenson dared not impeach her, lest, though he might ruin her, he should at the same time provoke her to discover some things in his life which would effectually cut him off from that portion of favour he still possessed with Mrs. Rayland, who, angry as she was with him, stocked the farm he retired to, furnished his house, and continued to him almost every advantage he enjoyed at the Hall, except the opportunity of making it a receptacle for smuggled goods. However that was, my aunt certainly continued to have great influence over Mrs. Rayland, though I often thought it was more through habit than love. And I am persuaded that, if she had not always guarded against the inclination which Mrs. Rayland at times betrayed to take your mother and sisters into favour, they would by degrees have acquired that ascendancy over her from their own merit, which Mrs. Lennard had now only from habit. But my aunt was too cunning to give them an opportunity, and that, I believe, was partly the reason why she was so afraid of my being taken into Mrs. Rayland's kindness, since nothing was more natural than for me to speak in their favour. She need not, however, have dreaded this, for however willing or anxious I might be, my awe of Mrs. Rayland was too great for me to aspire to the character of a confidant, and she looked upon me as a mere child. Probably our ages differed too much to allow any great sympathy between us, and I could give her no other pleasure than by attending to the stories she used to love to repeat of the days of her youth. But Mrs. Lennard, though by no means desirous of being herself the auditor, and never easy but when she could remain unmolested with her dear Mr. Roker, was still jealous lest her lady should feel any degree of kindness for me, and, I believe, by imputing to me faults which Mrs. Rayland took her word for, contrived gradually to get her consent for my going apprentice, under the idea of my being enabled to get my own bread honestly in business, while she obviated the inconvenience of my departure by introducing a new servant to be about her lady, who was entirely devoted to her own interests, and kept away the old cook as much as she could, whom Mrs Rayland never would part with, but whom my aunt feared and disliked, because she was an honest blunt creature, who never feared speaking her mind, and was particularly a friend of yours, as you may I am sure recollect. Latterly she became more than usually disagreeable to my aunt and Roker, because she used to rejoice in the thought that her dear young captain would one day or other be master of the Hall; and when Leonard angrily asked her how she dared talk of any one's being master of the Hall where her lady lived, she replied, that she dared talk so, because Madam herself had told her so. 'And where, my Monimia, is this good old friend of mine now?' asked Orlando. 'Her evidence may be of great importance to us.' 'Alas!' replied she, 'I know not. I only heard from your sister that Dr Hollybourn, who acted as executor to the only will that was produced, immediately discharged all the servants, giving to each of them a present above 2 years' wages, which Mrs Rayland had in that will given to each of the inferior ones; and, with many good words, got as many as he could of them into other services, at a distance from the country. But I recollect that the cook had relations in the neighbourhood of the Hall, of whom, I dare say, intelligence about her may be procured.' 'Ah, dear Orlando, if the account I have already given you of my unhappy life after your departure has affected you, what will you feel when I relate what passed afterwards, to which all my preceding sufferings were nothing? It is true that, as I lay listening of a night to the howling of the wind in the great melancholy room at the end of the north gallery, where I was locked up every night, I have frequently started at visions my fancy raised; and, as the dark green damask hanging swelled with the air behind them, I have been so much terrified as to be unable to move, or to summon to my recollection all the arguments you were wont to use against superstitious fear. Then too I have been glad even to hear the rats as they raced around the skirting boards, because it convinced me there were some living creatures near me, and helped me to account for the strange noises I sometimes heard. As winter went on, my misery in this great room became worse and worse, and such was my terror that I could hardly ever sleep. I once contrived to get candles, and set up a light in my room, but this only served to show me the great grim picture over the chimney, one of the Rayland family in armour, with a sword in his hand; and I was indeed, besides this, effectually cured of wishing for a light on the second night I tried it; for a party of my friendly rats, perceiving the candle, which was to them a delicate treat, took it very composedly out of the socket, and began to eat the end of it, which was not a light. This compelled me to leave my bed to put it out, and then to flight, while the terror I suffered was only increased by this attempt to mitigate it. Good God! how weak I was to add imaginary horrors to the real calamities of my situation, rather than try to acquire strength of mind to bear the evils from which I could not escape. It was at this time that Sir John Belgrave, who, on finding his insulting proposals treated with the contempt they deserved, had left the country for some time, returned thither; and as Jacob, his confidant, could no longer find means to put his letters in my way, or to harass and alarm me by coming to the door of the turret, he changed his plan, and pretended that his views were highly honourable. In a letter to my aunt he entreated her interest with me, and that she would prevail upon me to see him. And then it was, Orlando, that my sufferings were almost beyond the power of endurance. 'What!' exclaimed Orlando, 'was the infamous woman base enough then to betray you to this villain?' 'Have patience, I entreat you, Orlando. She betrayed me then, so far as to insist upon my seeing Sir John and hearing what he had to say. 'Eternal curses blast them both!' exclaimed Orlando. 'But I terrify you, my angel.' 'You do indeed,' answered Monimia; 'and I shall never, Orlando, conclude my mournful narrative, if you will not be more calm.' 'I will,' replied he; 'at least I will try at it. Pray go on.' 'I resisted this proposal of seeing Sir John Belgrave for many days, till my aunt, enraged at what she called my stupid idiotism, declared to me that, if I persisted to behave so senselessly, she would relate to Mrs Rayland all my clandestine meetings with you, and then turn me out of the house to take my own courses. I would willingly have left the house, and, rather than undergone one day longer the misery I hourly experienced, I would have begged my way to you in America.' Orlando sighed and shuddered. 'But when my cruel aunt threatened to take such means as I knew would ruin you, and blast all those hopes on which alone I lived, of seeing you return to happiness and independence, I own I could not bear to hazard it, and at length consented to see this detested suitor, not without some hope that my peremptory refusal repeated, for I had already given it him in writing, might put an end to all his hateful pretensions. A day therefore was fixed; but Sir John, either repenting that he had gone so far, or from some caprice, wrote to my aunt to say that he was that day sent for express to London, to attend a dying relation, from whom he expected a great acquisition of fortune. This might be true, I cared not whether it was or no, but blessed the fortunate relief from persecution. In the interim your father, who was taken ill some time before, died. Oh, how much did I see Selina suffer during his illness! How much did I suffer myself! And all was aggravated to an indescribable degree of wretchedness, by our believing that you, Orlando, were lost in your passage to America. If I thought my former condition insupportable, what was the increase of my sorrows now, when torn from the last consolation I had left, that of weeping sometimes with Selina! My aunt, almost as soon as Sir John Belgrave had left the country, informed me that she had found a person at Winchester willing to take me for a small premium, and that I was to go the following Thursday. I never knew how all this was settled, but very, very certain it is, that it was arranged between her lover Mr Roker, and Sir John Belgrave. She was impatient to have me gone, and sent the old cook to take care of me as far as Havant, where Mrs Newill, to whom I was consigned, met me, and conducted me to a little miserable apartment, which, with a small bow-windowed shop, she inhabited at Winchester, and where she was to teach me a business which I soon found she did not know herself. Mrs Newill was said to have been well brought up, but if she were, her having long associated with people in very inferior life, had considerably obliterated the traces of good education; and the inconvenient circumstances to which she had been exposed, in consequence of having had a brutal and extravagant husband, seemed at once to have soured her temper and relaxed her morals. She had some remains of beauty, and was fonder of talking of its former power than I thought redounded much to her honour. Her husband had possessed a place in the dockyard at Portsmouth, from whence he had been dismissed for some heavy offences, and lived now upon the wide world, while his wife was, by the assistance of her friends, trying to get into business to support herself. Their only son, a young man of 20, was in the navy. The greatest personal hardship I endured on this my change of abode, was sleeping in the same bed with Mrs Newill, which I did for the first week. But, fortunately for me, though it was probably much otherwise to her, her husband, believing she had money, for he had heard of her having taken an apprentice, came suddenly to her house, or rather lodging, and I was dismissed to a little closet in a garret with a truckle bed. but it was a paradise compared with my share of Mrs Newill's, for now I could weep at liberty, and pray for you. Volume 4, Chapter 9, Part 1. Recording by Julia Lenardon.